Hello, everyone. Welcome. Greetings. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us tonight for tonight's discussion on the Finnish Front Line with author Gordon F. Sander, who is joined tonight by Consul General of Finland, Jarmo Sareva. Gordon Sander is an acclaimed American writer and journalist who has worked as a foreign correspondent since 1976 for outlets including the New York Times, the Financial Times, the New York Review of Books, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and many others. He has been writing about Finland and Finnish history since 1977 and is the article of 10 books, including The 100-Day Winter War and Off the Map, A Personal History of Finland. His latest book, The Finnish Front Line, Kekkonen, Kennedy, and Khrushchev's Cold War Showdown, is a historical biography of Urho Kekkonen, the 8th and longest-serving president of Finland. We are delighted to have him here with us, as well as Consul General of Finland, Jarmo Sareva. Tonight's program will begin with a brief slideshow and exploration from Gordon about his history and background with Finland, followed by a reading from the book. After that will be a discussion, followed by an audience Q&A, and following that will be a brief reception. Copies of the book are also available for purchase and signing after the event. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and I will hand it to Gordon.
Am I on here? Yeah. Right. Thank you for coming. Very glad to be here. I'm glad to be anywhere. As Frederick Marx said in one of my favorite films, best years of our lives. But actually, seriously, this is a very big moment for me to do this here at Scandinavia House, in my relationship with Finland, of which this event is partly a celebration of, and which goes back almost 50 years. We began, in a way, here, with a travel grant that I got from American Scandinavian Foundation in 1977. But actually, it began with a book that my brother, Elliot, who is one of the godfathers of my relationship with Finland, left in our apartment in Jamaica Estates. And I happened to read this book. I think it was by Max Jakobsen. And before I read that book, I didn't know anything about Finland, really. And then I just sort of fell into Finland, reading this book, and here was a country whose history was sort of parallel with the rest of Europe, and which I knew something about European history, really knew nothing about. And so then I said to myself, I have to find out more about Finland, and ASF helped make it possible by giving me a travel grant. And I wound up going to Finland for what I thought was going to be 2 weeks, and wound up being a full month. And I wound up doing my first story for the New York Times about an airplane, a Soviet airplane, which was hijacked to Finland in July 1977 by 2 Russians who were trying to get away from Russia, and they tried to hijack the plane to Sweden because they knew they were going to get asylum in Sweden. But the loyal Aeroflot pilot, the relationship with Russia and Finland being what it was at that time, during the Kekkonen time, diverted the plane to Helsinki because he knew that the Finns would not let these hijackers go. And they didn't. And I wound up spending 24 hours at the airport in Helsinki waiting to see what was going to happen, and the Finnish police stormed the plane. The hijackers were arrested. The Eduskunta, the Finnish parliament, met for 2 days to try to decide what to do with these hijackers. But Finland being Finland, and the special relationship being what the special relationship was, in 1977, the hijackers were returned to the Soviet Union. That was Finland in 1977. But that was just one of the things that happened on that trip, that pivotal trip that planted the seed for my relationship with Finland. I also had a romance with a tourist guide there, but I won't tell you about that. But it was one of the great trips of my life. I went to Rovaniemi in Lapland, and I really saw what Finland was about. And it planted the seeds for what became and what has become, I suppose, my Finnish literary career, of which this book is the apotheosis. This is actually the 5th book that I've written about Finland. But the seeds for this book and the other important book that I've written about Finland, also wrote a book about the Winter War, were planted during that first visit in 1977, because I knew if you wanted to understand Finland, there were 2 things you had to understand, and one of them was the Winter War, Finland's finest hour. And there were posters. I'm sure most of you know about the war, the Finnish Winter War. The Finns fought with the Soviets, their country's finest hour. There still were a lot of veterans from that war. In 1977, there were posters. Legenda ila. The legend continues. But I knew that that's when the seed for that book was planted, but also that's when the seed for this book about Urho Kekkonen, who ruled Finland for 25 years, was planted. And here was a president who had his face on the currency, something like, I believe, our current president wants to do. Yeah. And so that's where the seed for the Winter War book was planted, and that's where the seeds for this book was planted. And also, I'm going to wind up reading a little bit of this book to you, not too much. You can start, throwing water at me when I've written too much. But also, I'm a photographer. I'm very proud of my photography. Probably wondering, this thing that I'm wearing on my lapel, it's Order of the Rose, Order of the Lion. And 7 years ago, President Niinisto, Finland's great president, honored me by giving me this medal. And I believe I was the first writer to get this since World War II, American writer. But on the diploma, it said journalist, historian, and photographer. So I've had 10 photo shows in Helsinki. So before I read from the book, to make this experience a 3-dimensional experience for you, I thought you might like to see some of the photos that I've taken of Finland over the years, which span my relationship with Finland. So, are you ready? And thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. Okay, so I think all right. I think we can go to the first one. All right. Okay. This is what Helsinki looked like in 1977. And isn't that different from what it looks like today? Except maybe those fellows wouldn't be wearing bell bottoms anymore, but which is a good idea of Finland during the summer. Summer is not just a season for defense, it's a religion. And so this was a slice of Finland in 1977. Okay. Next one. Right. So, one of the things that I did on my first visit, well, I was actually researching an article for the Atlantic Monthly about Finland, was to visit Tapiola, the garden city, which was one of the showcase of Finnish design. And these were the soccer team, football team, Tapiola. And that's also, on my visit, I understood how much design means to Finland. One of the mottos of Finland is designing nations. And I kind of saw that in that first video. Okay. Next one. Right, okay. So, these two Southern women are actually my girlfriend. No, they're actually, they are, this was taken during the Winter War, and they are plane spies on top of the post office. And it's amazing. It's very special. So I thought this was a striking picture. And it's from the Winter War. And the whole thing about the Winter War is that the entire society participated in that war. It wasn't just the soldiers. You know. When the big part of the Winter War was the Lappasfart, the women. And these were two Lappasfart female girls waiting for the Russian bombers to come over there. Okay. Okay, another flash forward 13 years, I had another life as an education writer. I wrote a book about Rod Serling. With the help of my very good friend Ron Simon. And to reward myself, I returned to Finland in 1990. That was occupied my great. My first article about Finland was about occupied. I don't know how many of you students do this. Great. One of the great places. And he's also a funny guy. And we became friends, and we're still friends. And Harry had his white Cadillac. Okay. There have been a few godfathers of my relationship with Finland. People who kept encouraging me to coming back. And one of them was Christian Inspire, who was the CEO of Radio City, which was Finland's first rock station. And Christine would meet me this way, and then we had fun. And his headquarters was a place called Lapakov, the Bat Cave. Some wild stuff went on there. And he was just a great man. And I met him, unfortunately, he passed away about 5 or 6 years ago. The point being that I didn't just wind up spending so much time in Finland on my own. There were a number of Finns who actively encouraged me to people to come back. Okay. Okay, and this is Senate Square. You know, Senate Square is the heartbeat of Helsinki. All roads in Finland lead back to Senate Square. And this is what Senate Square looked like in 1995. And every time I go back to Helsinki, and I must have gone to Helsinki at least maybe 40 or 50 times over the years. The first thing I do is I go to this, I walk to the top of the steps, and I think about my first visit to Helsinki. And it hasn't changed that much, actually. Okay. And here's Finnish girl looking at here's the movies that were being viewed at that time in 1991. I have to say, one of the things that really struck me when I first started going back to Finland frequently in the early 90s is that Finns really, they liked Americans. I mean, to read America to Finland, and they also, I had the same response in '77. America represented the democracy that they wanted to have. And now I think maybe it's the reverse. But there was a time in the early 90s when Finns heard my American accent and people smiled. They smiled automatically. They still smile, but not as enthusiastically, I have to say, it's the early 90s. Okay. And this is a vignette from the first book that I wrote about Finland, about the Winter War, and which I'm very proud of. And when I wrote this book 20 years ago, there still were enough veterans of the war around, people who actually remember the Winter War. And probably the most famous battle of the Winter War was the Battle of Suomussalmi. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. But, and that's where 2 regiments of Finnish ski troops obliterated 2 entire Soviet divisions by cutting them up into cordwood, into moti. They came out of the woods, and that's the Soviets wound up calling the Finnish troops the White Death. And these were people they were kids during that time. And the Suomussalmi was like the high point of the Winter War for the Finns. There was a point during the Winter War, it was only 106 days, but there was one point when the Finns actually were winning the war. And that was Suomussalmi. And they remember it. And so, of course, I actually went to Suomussalmi twice. So, and that was from that visit. Okay. And of course, one of the things that keeps me coming back to Helsinki are the women. And I think that's all I'm going to say about that. And here we are back in summer. And you know, when Finns have a good summer, as they say, a good summer, you know, it's nothing like it. You know, we people, you know, for us, summer is a season. For Finns, I think it's a religion. And when the Finns have a good summer, they are ecstatic. And you can see this on this image. And they're dancing by the lake near the Olympia Hole. What was the lake called? Tuolari. The lake, right? And so, and there's my relationship with Finland in a nutshell. All right. Thank you. It's been wonderful. All right. So that's the visual part of my presentation. Did anything mentioned about the photos or?
I think you picked a great selection of photos.
going back to your first visit, and I do know how transformative that first visit in 1977 was for you, and that really laid the foundation for you personally to come back and back and back over and over again, all those 40 times. And there's more photos in the book itself, and as you know, as you heard, it's going to be for sale after this event. So now, I guess we are listening. We will be hearing from you some of the actual excerpts from the book.
Yeah. Right. That's a good word. That first visit was transformative. And so, this was the visual dimension of this presentation. Now we get to the literary dimension, which I know you're all hot and bothered about. Seriously, this book, I spent 5 years. This book, this is actually the second version of this book. This book was originally published in Finland in Finnish. It was called Citizen Kekkonen. And I don't know, how many of you know it? Have you heard about, how many of you know about Kekkonen?
Gordon, if I may, before you start reading, if I may tell an anecdote. When my wife saw the LinkedIn posting of this event and of the book, she commented by writing Kekkonen, 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 Kekkonen. This goes back to counting the votes for the presidential elections, which back then were held not through a direct vote, but through electors. Each party put forth a list of candidates for electors. It was an indirect vote. And there's this classical recording from that first vote in 1956, and it is Kekkonen, 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 and so forth, so on and so forth. But it was a close vote. Kekkonen ended up winning by 1 vote.
Right. Actually, I was remiss. I forgot. Thank you, Laura Frederick Sanders, Director of Public Relations, for making this event happen. And thank you so much, Jarmo Sareva, the ambassador here, or your ambassador. I get them mixed up. I'm so finished. Thanks so much. But yes, Jarmo is a child of Kekkonen, sort of. Kekkonen era.
Not in the literal sense.
So, when I decided to write a book about Kekkonen, he was the longest serving European president before Orban. He was president for 25 years. He was incredible. And so I decided if I wanted to do a book about Kekkonen, and I didn't want to do the whole 25 years, but I wanted to focus on something called the note crisis. I don't know how many of you people heard about the note crisis, but you can tell us what was the note crisis about.
Well, we'll be hearing from you soon, but during the first term of President Kekkonen, there were 2 major foreign policy crises or scares, the night frost and then the note crisis. And the note crisis was ultimately about Finland's treaty with its eastern neighbor, the Soviet Union, from 1948. It was called the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance. And it was the mutual assistance part that was critical. Because in that treaty, which tied Finland, a democratic Western nation, to the security sphere of the Soviet Union, in that treaty, Finland pledged to defend itself if Germany, meaning at that time West Germany, or any country allied with Germany, would attack Finland itself or the Soviet Union through Finland. And the note that Finland got in those critical days, it actually implied that there was a threat of such an attack against Finland. And the Soviets then suggested that now it is time to look into this mutual cooperation part and start consultations between the two armed forces about preparations the preparations for that imminent attack.
Thank you. Just to explain why I decided to spend 5 years writing this book, and what surprised me about what I found. I decided to focus on the one period which explained Kekkonen's relationship with the Soviet Union. A lot of people were confused about that, or special relationship. You know, Finland was in the twilight zone between east and west. It was a very quick-sided relationship with Moscow. And it was a special relationship. And basically, the person who managed that relationship for Moscow was Kekkonen. And it was only once Moscow trusted him with managing that relationship that the template for that long presidency was set. And
Gordon, as you know, many people in Finland see Kekkonen either as a villain or as a hero, as somebody who, through very deft and skilled diplomacy and personal relationship with our eastern neighbor, was able to navigate the waters of the Cold War. Do you think? What do you think? Was Kekkonen a villain or a hero or something in between?
that's a hard question. A hero or a villain? Well, maybe we can get into that after I read it in the book. There's one other thing that really surprised me. First of all, before I wrote this book, as I did with all my books, I went into it without any preconceptions. I heard so many things about Kekkonen. There are people in Finland who love Kekkonen and people who hate him, but I kind of put that aside, and I went ahead and did this book. And like everything, is black and white. Basically, I think that Kekkonen was a great man. I'm not sure if Finland would have stayed independent without him, but with a serious asterisk. You know, he made some serious concessions to the Soviets in return for them allowing him to be president, basically, in the last year. But I think he was a great man. The people, I might have conducted about 80 interviews with this book, and I interviewed most of the chiefs of staff, and they all loved him. Most of them loved him. But not all Finns loved him, because of what happened to them during this time. The other thing that really surprised me, that I wasn't really aware of before I dove into the notes of this, which took place in 1961, which was the first year of the Kennedy presidency. It would go through a pivotal year in the Cold War. The same year as the Soviet. It was the same year as Kennedy's confrontation with Khrushchev in Vienna with Kennedy. In fact, I'm a Kennedy student. And I didn't realize that there was a point during this note process when, well, first of all, Kennedy welcomed Kekkonen to Washington for 2 days. He was his first presidential guest. And I'm going to read a little bit of the transcript of that meeting. But there was a point during the note process when Kennedy actually offered Kekkonen to get more involved. Not necessarily militarily, but he was willing to go to the United Nations and stand up for Finland. And in fact, there was a point there when Finland couldn't get the next beret. 1961 was the year of the Finnish process. And so again, Kennedy didn't understand what the Soviets were doing, and that's one of the reasons why he invited Kekkonen to Washington. He was hoping that he would be able to figure out Khrushchev by spending some time with Kekkonen, because Kekkonen had this relationship with Khrushchev. And they wound up spending 2 days in Washington. And fortunately, the State Department kept a stenographic record of that meeting, and it's the only record of any meeting that Kekkonen kept, because he didn't like Kekkonen records of his meetings. And also, there was another record of that meeting. One of my mentors was Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., who some of you may know was Kennedy's assistant, and also who I studied with at City University. And Arthur Schlesinger was at that meeting as well. And Arthur, who I became friendly with, actually wrote his own diary. And his record of that meeting was a little different than the State Department record. And fortunately, his son gave me access to his unpublished diary of that meeting. And that's also in the passage from the book that I'm going to read to you. But this was another reason why that was fascinating to me, because I didn't know anything about Kekkonen and Kennedy. So, on that note, there are 3 passages from the book that I'm going to read to you. You can signal to me when you're getting bored. But the first passage is about when our ambassador, Bernard Duffler, the American ambassador to Helsinki, made a secret visit to Kekkonen. Before Kekkonen, this was at the end of the note crisis. Kekkonen was about to fly off to Siberia to meet with Khrushchev. And Khrushchev had basically ordered Kekkonen to fly to Siberia. And they were going to work things out. And Kennedy dispatched our ambassador, Bernard Duffler, with a secret message offering to help. And this is what that visit was like. Locale, Helsinki, Finland. The road to Tamaniemi, the home of Urho Kekkonen, the 8th president of Finland. Late evening, November 1961. Fade in. I'm very cinematic. Fade in. An unmarked car belonging to the motor pool of the United States Embassy, Helsinki is speeding out of town en route to Meilahti, the Helsinki suburb, where Tamaniemi, the palatial home and principal residence of Urho Kekkonen, Finnish president, is located. The car has 2 passengers, Bernard Goeffler, the current American ambassador, and Erik Ljungqvist, the 23-year-old Finnish-speaking member of the embassy's economic section who served as interpreter. The president and the ambassador had a working relationship. Altogether, Goeffler had already made the 15 minutes technical help. Wonderful. The president and the ambassador had a working relationship. Altogether, Goeffler had already made the 15-minute journey by automobile to Tamaniemi a half a dozen times. This visit to Tamaniemi, however, was different. Quite different, as a matter of fact. This time, Goeffler was carrying a letter from the U.S. President, John Kennedy, addressed to Kekkonen. There was nothing innately extraordinary about that. Presidents send letters to each other all the time. However, this letter was not to be hand-delivered. According to the explicit instructions the ambassador had received from the U.S. State Department, he was only supposed to read Kennedy's letter verbally. Quote, message should be conveyed orally and written communication not left. The terse, top-secret memo accompanying Kennedy's teletyped message stated, Goeffler's visit was supposed to be strictly sub rosa. Approach should be made inconspicuously, the memo continued. Hence the unmarked car. We, the U.S., wish to avoid public knowledge that American ambassador saw President immediately before his departure to meet Khrushchev. No mention of Goeffler's visit was supposed to be made to the press. The precise date is November 21st, 1961, day 1543 of Kekkonen's presidency, day 23 of what would ultimately become known as the Note Crisis, the best-known political crisis in Finnish history and still the most controversial. Briefly, the crisis began on October 30th while the Finnish president was relaxing in Hawaii after what had been a successful tour of Canada and the United States. The highlight of Kekkonen's visit on October 16th and 17th was his stop in Washington, which included an elaborate luncheon at the White House for him and his wife Sylvie, and 2 lengthy dialogues with Kennedy and Dean Rusk, JFK's interventionist-minded Secretary of State. Then, 2 weeks later, while Kekkonen and his advisors were all basking in the afterglow of his much-publicized visit, Andrei Gromyko, remember Andrei Gromyko? Good friend of mine. No, just kidding. The pale-faced Soviet foreign minister handed Urho Kekkonen, the long-time Finnish ambassador to Moscow, a démarche invoking Article 2, the dread clause of the 1948 Finno-Soviet Agreement of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, which Jarmo mentioned. Said clause, entitled either signature to arrange a call for joint military consultations in the event of a serious threat of war by West Germany or its NATO allies, via Finnish territory. And then this was the time, Finland just joined NATO. This was the time when I think that notion of Finland ever joining NATO would have been unthinkable. With the new Berlin crisis, which the impulsive Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev had triggered 3 years before, still boiling, the Kremlin contended that such a threat by the revanchist West German regime existed. Consequently, such consultations between the military staffs of the two countries were a must. The talks, if the Finns had agreed to participate in them, would unquestionably have damaged Finnish neutrality, while also reducing Finland to the Grand Duchy status it held during Russian imperial time. Once again, Moscow had dropped the boom on the pesky Finns, just as it had 3 years before during the so-called Night Force crisis, except that this time the boom was accompanied by the very audible and lethal sound produced by the 50-megaton atomic bomb. The Soviets test dropped in the Arctic several hours before Gromyko's meeting with Vorid. Caught with his swimming trunks down, Kekkonen initially downplayed the seriousness of the note, as it came to be called, insisting that nothing about Finland's relationship with the nuclear-armed neighbor to the east had really changed. He pointed out that the body of the strident-sounding letter had been directed against West Germany and its putatively bellicose Nordic NATO allies, Norway and Denmark. Nevertheless, the truth was that it was the Finnish government to whom the démarche had been addressed. It was the Finnish government that Moscow was insisting on having joint military consultations with. And it was the Finnish government that would have to respond to that demand. Keep calm and carry on had been Helsinki's motto. And so more or less the Finnish public had, while their most cautious Swedish neighbors had begun preparations for evacuating their government and making other preparations for the worst. In fact, I know a lot of Swedes were also pretty freaked out at that time. During the 3 weeks since it had been delivered, while Finland and its neighbors lived in the shadow of the nose, in Kekkonen's phrase, the Finnish president had done everything he could to assuage Moscow and avoid the fact that his putative Soviet friends really did want to have those consultations. Or else. Or else what? Who knew? A demand to include Finnish communists in the next coalition government, a new Soviet base on Soviet unfinished soil. Who knew? In any event, in collapsing middle, Khrushchev had agreed to meet Kekkonen, who was sweating it out, and had been sweating it out since he got that note in Hawaii in his swimming trunks. Not in Moscow, but in faraway Novosibirsk in Siberia, while the Soviet leader was on a tour of agricultural communes. Khrushchev would not come to Moscow to meet his Finnish friend. If his Finnish friend wished to meet him, he would have to come to him. Kekkonen agreed. It was set. The Soviet leader would receive the Finnish president at a cottage on the outskirts of Novosibirsk the following Friday, November 23rd, 1961. No Finnish or Western reporters would be allowed to attend. And this is where Kennedy comes in, and our relationship with Finland at that time. Ever since the end of the Second World War, the post-war Finnish rapprochement with the USSR and the post-war Finnish rapprochement with the USSR, Washington had adhered to a strict hands-off policy vis-a-vis Finland and the special relationship. Finland was too far away. Finland was too far away. As Dean Acheson, then U.S. Secretary of State, put it in a memo he wrote President Truman in 1950, when Finland was laboring under the political weight of the 1948 Agreement of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, it would be most dangerous to make any efforts in the direction of Finland that would produce a reaction on the part of the Russians. But simply, hands off. And that was the American relationship with Finland until 1961. Now there was a turning point, or really a possible turning point. Now on the eve of Urho Kekkonen's pilgrimage to Siberia, President Kennedy, on the strong advice of his activist-minded Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, remember Dean Rusk, had decided to revamp that policy. If we continue to maintain a hands-off position, Rusk warned Kennedy, the Soviets are likely to achieve a good portion of their objectives. I'm moving forward a little. In the phrase of Goeffler's predecessor, Ambassador John Hickerson, it was time to get into the game with Moscow over Finland. This involved a readiness to assist Finland in the political, economic, and propaganda spheres. According to the aggressive New American line, the U.S. not only respected Finnish neutrality, it was willing to fight for it in every way, short of war. Even though the threat of a literal Russian invasion was slim, the threat of Finland being reduced to a Soviet satellite was substantial. Substantial enough for the U.S. to become more involved. Finland was more than another neutral now. Rusk maintained it was an ally neutral. The northeastern border of the free world now extended to the Finno-Soviet border, and Finland was a proxy for Western interests. The only problem with this new equation, Rusk conceded, was the person to whom the free world was entrusting as surrogate for its interests, Urho Kekkonen. The simple fact was that Rusk did not trust Kekkonen. The Finnish president was too pliable, the State Department's favorite word to describe him, along with, quote, clever. Still, given the situation, the U.S. did not have much choice but to trust Kekkonen. While Kekkonen has shown himself, in our view, overtly pliable in the past in his relationship with the USSR, Rusk wrote, there seems to be no alternative but to place reliance upon him. The following day, November 21st, 1961, JFK hastily endorsed the new U.S. line on Finland and approved the fighting message Rusk had composed for him, which then had been cabled to Ambassador Goeffler. Now Goeffler was carrying that message to Tamaniemi to impress it on its presidential residence. Quote, on the eve of your departure, I can't remember Kennedy, I'd like to. On the eve of your departure for Novosibirsk, I am sending you this private message. Read the key line of the top secret message to Kekkonen, so that you may not be in doubt of the position of the United States. You will appreciate that our concern in this matter derives not alone from our great interest in the welfare of your country. We have placed on ourselves a solemn obligation to respect that neutrality at all times and in all ways. By the same token, Kennedy's letter continued, quote, in our national interest, we have to expect that in turn, Finland will in fact be truly neutral. In football terms, Rusk had relayed the ball to Kennedy, the metaphorical quarterback for the U.S. team, and Kennedy had now thrown it to his man down the field, Guffler, who was about to pass it on to Kekkonen, who was expected to carry the ball for the West. The question was, would he? Would Kekkonen give his putative friend, Nikita Khrushchev, as good as he got when they met at that cottage in Siberia? Now we're back to the present. That means to the present. Picture this as a movie. This is the way I pictured this. This book is beginning in a very cinematic way. Guffler's unmarked car was approaching Kamehameha now. Above all, neither John Kennedy nor Dean Rusk wished to pressure Kekkonen, who himself was something of a combustible commodity, or to be seen as doing so, etc., etc., etc. Now the U.S. was prepared to go to the mat for Finland. The question was, would President Kekkonen be willing to go to the mat for the U.S. and the West when he met Khrushchev in Siberia? Above all, Guffler's visit was supposed to be secret. Well, should the press learn of your meeting, suggest you say only that you called to obtain President Kekkonen's views. You should agree with Kekkonen beforehand on this line to be followed to the press in case of queries or leaks. Everything was on the QT, highly confidential, as that line in that famous movie goes. Right? Okay, so that's the first passage. Are you getting for one more?
That was super exciting, and I guess everybody is really eager to hear what actually happened. If Gordon is reading it to you, or maybe you'll read it in the book yourselves. But please, you can continue. And great cinematic effects as well.
Okay, I'm going to read just a short passage from the next passage about. Actually, we go back in time to October 1961. Kennedy and Kekkonen are meeting at the White House after their great luncheon. Meanwhile, President Kennedy had entered the Oval Office. Seating himself in the rocking chair he favored because of his bad back, a difficulty he had had since his student days, and had been compounded by the near-fatal injury he suffered when his ship, PT-109, was sunk by the Japanese. He now joined the meeting. Kennedy, who had caught the tail end of the dialogue between Kekkonen and Rusk had kind of opened things up, quickly got to the point. This is from the State Department record. President Kennedy summarized the importance of the German question for the West, that is the Berlin crisis. He said he had done all we could to integrate Germany into the rest of Europe. And whatever the outcome of the present crisis, Germany's ties to the West must not be impaired. Trying to ingratiate himself with his host, Kekkonen said he understood Kennedy's position while conveying what he had learned from Brezhnev after he had pressed him about Berlin during the recent meeting in Helsinki. So basically, in this meeting between Kennedy and Kekkonen, Kennedy kept pressing Kekkonen what was going on with that man in Moscow. You know, in the early 60s, I'm sure some of you are old enough to remember, Khrushchev was referred to as that man in Moscow. And Kennedy kept pressing Kekkonen what was going on with this guy. Why is he making it so difficult for us? And Kekkonen professed, at first basically Kekkonen tried to sort of take the Soviet point of view, and then I'm kind of, but also Kennedy made it clear that the United States was ready to go to war over Berlin. And in this meeting between Kekkonen and Kennedy, which took place a year before the missile crisis, it took place at a very interesting moment. It was midway between the Bay of Pigs crisis, which wound up being, Kennedy's great failure, and the missile crisis, which is in October of 1962. The meeting between Kennedy and Kekkonen takes place at midpoint between those two moments, and you can really see the Kennedy of the missile crisis emerging in the meeting with Kekkonen. For the third time, JFK restated the U.S. position. He said that he hoped that the Soviets would be prepared to reserve our rights to access any agreement. Otherwise, there might be war. Now the two presidents began to mix it up a bit as Kekkonen tried to take the Soviet side. President Kekkonen said that Soviets always use the argument that the West doesn't really want the reunification of Germany, to which Kennedy immediately responded. President Kennedy said that Germany was now divided, and this was a fact. The Soviets were taking an unnecessary risk in forcing us to associate formally with them in proclaiming this. This is when Moscow was pressing the United States to recognize the East German regime, and Kennedy did not want to do that. To do this would bring about the end of NATO and of the European community. Once again, Kennedy brought Finland back into the picture. We were of the opinion that a strong Europe was a great help to Finland, he declared, and that if the West collapsed, this would be very harmful to Finland's own interest. America's fight was Finland's fight, was it not? Kekkonen seems to have been slightly taken aback here. Demurring from Kennedy's collective call to arms, the Finn said that he was only trying to be helpful. And so it went back and forth, and one moment Kekkonen is apologizing for the Soviets, but then I'm just flashing forward to the end of this very long meeting. Kennedy kept pressing Kekkonen, why did Moscow allow Finland to have the freedom that it had, and basically Kekkonen said he didn't know. We didn't know either. It beats us, He didn't understand Khrushchev ultimately either way. So this is a very interesting meeting between Kekkonen and Khrushchev. And now I'm flashing forward to the third passage I wanted to read you from for just a few minutes. What happened ultimately? Basically, Kekkonen flew off to Siberia. Basically, Kekkonen said no thanks to Kennedy. He didn't want the United States to get involved. Kekkonen flew off to Siberia, and then he came back to Helsinki, and he gave one of the most controversial speeches of his presidency, And basically he kind of said, oh no, the Soviets don't want to make war with us, and we love Khrushchev, and everything's going to be cool, you know. And that was that. And of course, Washington was very disappointed. Kennedy was disappointed. And so the big question was, now we're getting up to a press conference that Kennedy gave, that the press was very interested to know what did Kennedy think about what was going on with Finland. And there was a moment, because Kennedy had not really said to the press how he felt about Finland. Everything had been secret up until that point. As it happens, the world found out how John Kennedy felt about Finland, or more precisely, what he intended to do about Finland or not at his next press conference the following day, November 29th, 1961. You remember the Kennedy press conferences? They're great video, great TV. Kennedy was at his best in his press conferences. One assumes that, like Dean Rusk, his Secretary of State, JFK was also disappointed with the performance of his Finnish counterpart, for whom he had rolled out the White House red carpet 6 weeks before. Still, Kennedy had not said anything about it in public. Had the official U.S. policy toward Finland, including confronting Moscow over its aggression against Finland, changed? If Kennedy was looking for an opening for a new front with Moscow over Finland, here it was. The Finnish and Nordic Washington correspondents amongst the 372 reporters that afternoon in the auditorium of the State Department were particularly interested in hearing what Kennedy had to say in the matter. Everything hinged on the president's opening statement. In the event there was no mention of Finland in the statement, Kennedy's focus, as it had been at all of his recent press conferences, was the East-West conflict. There also was a new front Kennedy was increasingly concerned about in South Vietnam. Remember Vietnam? Where there had been increased fighting between U.S.-backed forces and North Vietnamese-backed communist ones. Just 2 weeks before, on November 14, 1961, Kennedy had made the fateful decision to increase the number of U.S. advisors in Vietnam from 1,000 to 16,000 over the next 2 years. Still, no mention of Finland. Then Kennedy took questions. In the event, one of the things that Kennedy had done was that he had given an interview to Izvestia. Remember Izvestia, the Russian newspaper? One of the reporters at the conference, it is not clear from the transcript, decided to use one of Kennedy's more pointed answers in response to a question about what he most objected to about the Soviet system. Actually, Kennedy said he didn't like the Soviet system in this interview, which was published in Izvestia. In your interview with Izvestia, the reporter asked, you said that the thing you objected to most about the Soviet system was the lack of political choice. I wonder, the questioner continued, how would you describe how that objection applied to Finland, where it appears that the only Soviet candidate for president was forced to leave the race? Footnote, after Kekkonen came back from Siberia, the only other candidate in the race stepped out. Basically, he was forced to step out, Olavi Hanka. Kennedy hesitated for a moment, but only a moment. I would prefer to make that as a general statement, he responded, refusing to be drawn in, rather than apply it to any particular country, because some countries are having difficulties at this time. And I'm not sure that any statement I might make at this time would be of assistance to them. And there it was in a nutshell. JFK had decided not to confront Moscow over Finland. He had too many other fronts or potential fronts to worry about Berlin, Vietnam, and Cuba. Now he was pulling the U.S. back to the Atchison-Dulles line on Finland. American policy regarding Finland had been reset, and so essentially it would remain for the next 30 years. Through the remainder of Urho Kekkonen's presidency until the fall of the Soviet Union. And that, except for the occasional well-meaning statement of support from one American official, was essentially that.
Thank you, Gordon. That was super, super exciting and interesting. And of course, you have done your research very thoroughly, but you are also an excellent writer. This is a quality book, and I look very much forward to actually reading it. I have skimmed through it, but I will be reading it. Now, we'll soon have time for questions from the audience, but...
Before we get to that,
yeah.
Is there anything else that you would like to say about Kekkonen?
Yes. Let me first comment on what you just read at the very end about President Kennedy's response. I think the one thought that comes to mind is the fact that in diplomacy or in life and human interaction in general, there's always the option of shutting up, of not speaking your mind. That is sometimes essential to diplomacy and successful diplomacy. And JFK really demonstrated that ability. He did not comment and therefore put Finland at risk. My question about President Kekkonen to you would be, listen, Gordon, you first came to Finland in 1977. That was in the deep Kekkonen years. And he left office then in 1981.
That was one of his fourth term.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And after Kekkonen left, Finland amended its constitution. There are now term limits. Any president is limited to serving 2 consecutive 6-year terms. And I think that was a natural move that we made after having had a president for 25 years. My question to you, having, you have been an astute observer of Finland and Finnish politics and Finnish history for a long time. You are one of the foremost U.S. scholars and commentators on Finland. What do you think has been Urho Kekkonen's legacy to Finland?
Right. Well, that's a very good question. There are 2 kinds of legacies. There's a political legacy and there's cultural legacy. The political legacy, I think, was almost, first of all, I would say self-censorship. The Finnish press was used to, you've heard of self-censorship when you censor yourself. The Finnish press was used to censoring itself during the Kekkonen period. So, for example, during this hijacking that I covered in 1977, the Finnish press was not very upfront about what happened and the fact that they were returning these hijackers to the Soviet Union and who probably were going to get executed, and I would say, and even after the fall of the Soviet Union, I think there still was some self-censorship. I think the Sanomat was still afraid to really say it like what it was for a few years. But that's one legacy, political legacy. And also the first president, Khrushchev, was also another legacy. During the early 90s, one of the big questions that's when the Balts, where I live now in Riga, in the Balts, because I felt that I could make a contribution there. And in the early 90s, when the great stories was, the Soviet Union was falling apart, and the three Balts, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, were breaking away. Sometimes, in some cases, with fatalities. They were shooting in Riga and in Vilnius. And Koivisto, Mauno Koivisto, who was Kekkonen's successor, he said, he was on record as saying to the Balts, go slow. Go slow. Don't rock the boat.
And I don't think that was the finest hour of Finland's foreign policy at that time, but against the backdrop of the times and the legacy from the Kekkonen years, maybe it was simply a fact of life in human nature, asking the Balts to go slow.
Do you remember when Koivisto said that?
I do.
Yeah. So there are two types of legacy. There's the political legacy and there's cultural legacy. The people who I met when I came, in the 90s were the most exciting decade to me. Because Finland was breaking away, both politically and culturally. And that's where my role came in. I was the guy who was writing about interesting stuff that was happening in Finland, in design and film. And all my friends of my generation, Muskar, Thomas Matti, they all talked about Czechoslovakia. They were freeing themselves from Czechoslovakia. And not just politically, but spiritually. They were breaking away. And so I would say that was also a cultural legacy. But that, conversely, that's also what made the 90s so exciting. And also that's, to me, why being in the Balts right now is very exciting. Because now the Balts, which have been independent for 30 years, now they're breaking away. The difference is that we're still under the shadow of the war right now. There's a new war going on in my part of the world. I'm sure you've heard about the drone blitz. Latvia just tested its first national siren this week, where we are in the outer zones of a war right now. So I'm very concerned about what's happening in my part of the world. At the same time, one other thing, I just came back from Hungary. My last story was in Hungary. I don't just stay in the Nordic region. One of my editors calls me Nordic Man. But last month, Nordic Man went to Hungary. And I have to tell you, it was a great story. It's so, most of the stories that I've had to report over the last 10 years have been depressing ones. But Hungary is now the hope of Europe. And it was so fantastic to see a country throw off, to depose peacefully a would-be tyrant in the Putin mold. It was just an incredible thing.
One more question, and then we'll go to the audience.
Yeah.
You have written, one of your books is about the escape of your mother's family from Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
And that brought to my mind, that came to my mind today when I read an op-ed article in New York Times. I think it was by David French. And his thesis was basically about how come we are going back to the bad old ways, affiliation or even enchantment with both extreme left and extreme right, anti-Semitism, and the column quoted, I think it was Winston Churchill, who said that if you don't remember the history, if you don't keep the lessons of history in mind, you are bound to repeat them. So with your family history and with your deep knowledge and understanding of European and especially Nordic and also Baltic history. How concerned are you about Europe and the globe going back to the bad old ways and repeating those mistakes?
Yeah, well, obviously it's very scary. There's a return of anti-Semitism in Europe right now. In France, in England, I'm sure you were talking in England. I'm pleased to say there has not been anything like it in the books. And I have to say about anti-Semitism in Finland, one of the things that drew me to Finland in the first place is that during World War II, Himmler, Finland and Germany had a quasi-alliance during World War II. In fact, my last book is about that. Darkest, greatest controversy in Finnish history, besides the note crisis, was why did the Finns go to war with the Germans? And my last book is about that. But one of the things that I love about Finland, is Finland had a Jewish community, was that Himmler flew to Helsinki. Himmler flew to Helsinki, and President Ruti refused to give up the Finnish Jews. And Himmler wanted Finland to give up their Jews, and the Finns refused, and I remember that. So Finland, I think, is relatively free of anti-Semitism. The Balts are relatively, but yes, it's scary. I used to live in London. I mean, it's coming back. But not all over, but yes, it's coming back. The virus of anti-Semitism is out.
I would agree with you that Finland, and I'm extremely proud of that, has remained relatively free of the kind of rise of anti-Semitism that you see in many other European countries. And you also mentioned the fact that we did not hand over any Finnish Jews to Nazi Germany during the war. And let me remind everybody that Finland remained an essentially democratic country through the interwar period and during the war itself. It was not perfect. The Communist Party was outlawed, but in essence, we remained a democratic society even during the war, and then were able to navigate the very difficult and complex Cold War period with some success. And even if there was the legacy, both political and cultural legacy that you mentioned, we were still able to remain a Western market economy with a democratic system throughout all these years. And it's my sense that both politically and culturally we have emerged as a country thoroughly now integrated into the Western community, having joined the European Union together with Sweden and Austria in 1995, and then, of course, as we know, having joined NATO in 2023, followed by Sweden. So thank you so much for your insights. Now we do have time for a few questions from the audience, and who would like to be the first?
Democracy is being able to maintain it and just grow. Was the philosophy that came from, and I'm not sure exactly right, the criminal strength is in previously brains. So that basically to be a success as a country, we need to focus on education and making the most of the partners and select out a good portion of the population to be educated. When you have a small country, if you want to get somewhere in the world, you have to
question. Well, that's quite a question there, isn't it? I mean, you mentioned education. One of the things that I admire most about Finland is that Finland has one of the best educational systems in the world. And I have to say that's one of the reasons why Finland has remained relatively immune to the anti-Semitic virus. When you mentioned about kitchen. And yes, I think that the trees have something to do with it too. But Finland, Finland has a great educational system. And I think it just has a great civic system. And then also, Finns have a great sense of civics. Finns vote. Finns respect lawyers. Finland may be the most law-abiding. It's also one of the most least corrupt countries in the world. And I think it goes back to the education system.
Yeah, and the fact that we have a well, actually, let me start by saying that I think it was Thomas Jefferson who said something like a well-educated or well-informed population is the best guarantee of democracy. And the fact that we have a well-informed citizenry means that we have also been not only more immune to anti-Semitism, but more immune to the kind of disinformation that you see, that you face every day, every hour online, much of which is orchestrated by our eastern neighbor. So that is an accomplishment, but it is something that we have to fight for every single day and ensure that the citizenry remains an informed one.
I just want to mention one other thing, I'm sure you. Thank you for paying attention for so long. Why I love Finland. There's so many reasons why I love Finland, but people ask me the difference between living in Helsinki, and I've lived in Helsinki too, and living in Riga, and I love both, and I'm past the point where I compare countries, but I have to say that the value of life is a little higher in Finland. When people ask me the difference between Riga and Helsinki, when I step off a curb in Helsinki, and I have to think about it. When I step off a curb in Riga, I have to think about it. Why? Because it's still the shadow of the Soviet time. People drive like crazy, and I just think the value of life isn't quite as high as it is in Helsinki. Another comment, I once had an English girlfriend, and we went to Helsinki for the first time. And she said, it's nice to be in a country that works. Everything works in Finland. The buses are on time. The trains are on time. Finland works. And that's another thing. I can always rely on Finland.
I think you have a great point here. And most of you probably know that Finland has ranked as the happiest country in the world for 8 years. I think it's 8 years in running now. We are somewhat skeptical ourselves about that thing, how come, and I sometimes joke myself that the real reason is that everybody else is still more miserable than we are. But I think maybe the best explanation is that it is a country that works, that there's not that much of a transaction cost to living there and working there. Things work as expected, and that breeds, if not happiness, then contentment, satisfaction in daily lives. Would you agree with that? The fact that Finland is a country where everything works,
yeah.
It breeds satisfaction, contentment in one's life.
Satisfaction.
Yes.
Yeah, well,
And happiness.
Happiness. The cliche, I'm sure you've heard that Finland is the happiest country in the world. Finns pride themselves on being the happiest country in the world. And happiness can be defined several ways. But I think, yes, one of the ways you can define it is job satisfaction. The quality of life in Finland is I hate the word happy, but Finns are content. But now they're getting more worried about Russia again. And on that note, I think we're going to leave people. Right?
Yeah. Any last word? Anybody? We have time for one more question.
Thank you, Gordon. In your travels to Finland, in your conversations with folks on the ground, can you just describe the shift in this attitude towards Russia pre and post Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine?
Right. One of the reasons, the Finns, I wrote an essay for the Washington Post, one of the publications I work for, about the similarity between the Winter War and the war in Ukraine. And I think one of the reasons why Finland is one of the countries really that believes that the future of democracy depends on what happens in Ukraine is because of the Winter War and because they had a not dissimilar experience with the Soviet Union. And I think that some Finns have volunteered to fight. And I think they're right. I think the future of democracy, hangs on what happens in Ukraine. But I have to say, I certainly was heartened to see what happened in Hungary last month. Putin was trying to pull Hungary into the Russian orbit. And one of the things that I heard in the subways in Budapest was "fuck Russia."
Well, thank you so much, Gordon. Final note, you referred to Finnish volunteers fighting in Ukraine. We are at the Scandinavia House. This is the home of the 5 Nordic nations here in, not only here in New York, but also in the United States. And on a personal note, I can tell that my maternal grandfather was a Swedish volunteer fighting for Finland during the Winter War. So this strikes a very deep chord among Finns and also with me personally.
And then you have to read my book about the Winter War.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and thanks again to Gordon, and congratulations on the publication of your amazing book. Anyone who would like to purchase, there are copies over there, and Gordon is available for signing. $35. Yes, thank you again to everyone, and thank you.